I still remember the sound my truck tires made crunching over the gravel that Sunday evening because it was the last normal sound I heard before my stomach dropped. I pulled into my driveway after spending the weekend helping my oldest daughter replace a deck, looked toward the back of my property like I always did, and my workshop was simply gone. Not damaged, not burned, not sitting there with a broken door. Gone. 21 years of my life had been erased so completely that for a second I honestly wondered if I'd somehow driven to the wrong house. There was nothing left except churned-up dirt, scattered splinters, and a strip of bright orange warning tape fluttering from my mailbox like somebody thought that made everything perfectly reasonable. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 72 years old, retired after almost 5 decades as a carpenter in Cedar Hollow, Washington. And that little workshop wasn't some hobby shed people laughed at. That place held every lesson my father ever taught me. Every birthday gift I built for my grandchildren, every late night when I couldn't sleep after my wife passed away and the smell of fresh cedar somehow made the house feel less empty. Sitting inside had been nearly 200 hand tools I'd collected over 40 years, custom planes I'd restored by hand, walnut boards I'd been saving for my youngest granddaughter's wedding chest, and a cast iron table saw built in 1949 that my father bought after returning from the war. You can't put insurance value on things like that because they aren't just objects anymore. They're chapters of your life. I climbed out of my truck feeling like my knees belonged to somebody 20 years older, walked across the dirt where my shop used to stand, and just stared. Someone had even swept the concrete slab clean before hauling everything away. It looked organized, professional, almost polite, which somehow made it worse. Then I noticed the envelope taped to the mailbox. Inside was a formal notice from the Homeowners Association stating that my unauthorized auxiliary structure had been removed under newly adopted architectural compliance guidelines. According to the letter, I now owed $16,400 for demolition, debris removal, and landscape restoration. I actually laughed out loud because my brain refused to process something that ridiculous. Then I saw the signature at the bottom, Preston Calloway, HOA president. I'd met Preston exactly twice since he moved into the neighborhood 3 years earlier. Young guy, maybe early 40s, sold some software company for millions if local gossip was true, drove one of those electric SUVs that practically whispered down the street, always talked about bringing our community into the future. Most of us old-timers just smiled and let him talk because eventually people like that usually discovered life wasn't a business presentation. Monday morning, I walked into the HOA office carrying the citation, expecting there had to be some misunderstanding. Preston barely looked up from his laptop before saying, "Mr. First, Bennett, your workshop violated our updated visual standards." The board voted unanimously. I asked him one simple question. Did anyone think about calling me before bulldozing my property? He leaned back in his chair like he was explaining something obvious to a child and smiled in that polished corporate way that never reaches a person's eyes. The notices were mailed. I told him I never received a single one. He shrugged. Then perhaps you should check your mailbox more often. I felt my face getting warm, but I kept my voice steady. Years of dealing with impossible construction clients had taught me that the first person who loses their temper usually loses the argument too. I asked where my tools were. He said they had been disposed of because they were considered abandoned materials. I asked about my father's saw. He looked genuinely confused, as if sentimental value wasn't something he'd ever had to calculate. Then he said the sentence I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Honestly, Harold, this neighborhood isn't trying to preserve old junk. We're building something modern here. Maybe it's time to let go of the past. I just looked at him for a few seconds. There wasn't any anger left, only disappointment. Not because he'd insulted me, but because he truly believed he had the authority to decide what parts of another man's life deserved to exist. I nodded once, thanked him for his time, and walked out without another word. On the drive home, I stopped at the grocery store, bought a frozen apple pie, vanilla ice cream, and a fresh bag of coffee. Whenever life got complicated, my late wife used to say, "Never make important decisions on an empty stomach." That evening, I heated the pie, made coffee, unlocked the old fireproof filing cabinet she'd insisted we buy back in 1978, and started pulling out property records that hadn't seen daylight in decades. I wasn't looking for revenge. Not yet. I was simply trying to answer one question that suddenly refused to leave my mind. How had a homeowners association I never wanted to join somehow convinced itself it could bulldoze a building sitting on land my family had owned since before half those houses even existed? About an hour later, I spread my original deed across the kitchen table beside a newer neighborhood plat map I'd saved years earlier. Lined up both survey lines with a ruler, and something didn't match. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the longer I stared, the more obvious it became. Either the county survey was wrong, or someone had quietly moved a boundary that was never theirs to move. I barely slept that night because every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that empty patch of dirt where my workshop had stood for over 2 decades. But sometime around 4 in the morning, frustration gave way to curiosity, and curiosity has always been far more useful than anger. I made another pot of coffee, spread every document across the kitchen table again, and started comparing dates instead of property lines. By sunrise, I'd found something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The legal description on my original deed from 1978 was identical to the county survey I'd paid for years earlier when we refinanced the house, but the neighborhood map attached to the HOA's governing documents showed my western property line shifted just enough to pull my workshop inside their supposed jurisdiction. Not by much, maybe 8 or 9 feet. But just enough for someone who never checked the paperwork to assume they owned authority over that corner of my land. I stared at those maps for another 10 minutes before picking up my phone and calling the only person I trusted with something like this, Attorney Daniel Foster. Dan wasn't just my lawyer. 20 years earlier, I built the crib both of his daughters slept in, then later handmade their dining table as a wedding gift for his oldest. We hadn't talked in months, but the moment he answered and heard my voice, he said, "Harold, you don't usually call this early unless somebody did something incredibly stupid." I laughed for the first time since Sunday. I think they may have. He asked me to bring every document I had. So by 9 that morning, I was sitting across from him while he quietly examined each page without saying much. Every few minutes, he'd adjust his glasses, compare survey numbers, flip another page, then check something on the county GIS website. 6 minutes passed, 7 maybe. Suddenly, he leaned back in his chair, rubbed both hands across his face, and started laughing so hard he had to take his glasses off. I remember blinking at him because I honestly thought stress had finally broken the poor man. When he caught his breath, he looked at me and said, "Harold, these people didn't just trespass. They built their entire authority on land they never legally annexed." I frowned. "Explain that in carpenter language," he smiled. "Simple. You never join the HOA. I told him the previous owner had asked years ago if I'd be interested after a neighboring subdivision expanded, but I declined because my wife and I had no interest in paying dues for rules we didn't need. Dan nodded. "Exactly. Your refusal stayed on record." In 2020, the board filed amended neighborhood boundaries with the county planning office, but they never obtained individual consent from every affected owner. They simply colored your parcel inside the map and hoped nobody noticed. I felt my stomach tighten. "So," he finished the sentence for me, "they never had authority over your property." Not one day. The room went quiet. I wasn't thinking about the workshop anymore. I was thinking about every annual assessment they demanded, every warning letter they'd mailed, every neighbor who had quietly paid fines because they assumed the board actually possessed legal power. Dan must have seen the expression on my face because he turned his monitor toward me and pointed at several highlighted parcels surrounding mine. "You're not the only one. Harold, look here." These lots were added the same way. There were dozens. Families I'd known for years. Retired teachers, mechanics, nurses, widows, veterans. People who trusted official-looking paperwork because most decent people don't expect others to manufacture authority out of thin air. Dan looked at me carefully before asking, "Do you want your workshop back? Or do you want to know how deep this goes?" That question changed everything. Until that moment, I'd only wanted compensation for what they'd destroyed. Now I wanted answers. By Wednesday morning, Dan had filed a lawsuit alleging trespass, unlawful demolition, destruction of private property, conversion of personal assets, and fraudulent exercise of governing authority. The estimated damages for my workshop alone exceeded $55,000 once replacement costs, sentimental restoration, and professional reconstruction were included. Less than an hour after the complaint was electronically filed, my phone rang. Preston. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded very different from Monday, less confident. "Harold, I'm sure we can resolve this without making things public. I looked out the kitchen window toward the empty foundation and calmly replied, "It became public the moment your bulldozers crossed my property line." He insisted their attorneys believed the board had acted properly. I simply said, "Then they won't mind explaining that to a judge." Before hanging up, I heard him whisper something to another person in the room. It sounded suspiciously like, "Find out where he got those surveys." Over the next week, Dan and his staff uncovered something even worse. Internal HOA meeting minutes showed multiple board members had questioned whether several older homes had ever legally joined the association. But Preston repeatedly insisted the issue was administratively insignificant and pushed everyone to move forward with stricter enforcement anyway. That phrase would eventually haunt him. Administrative, insignificant. Funny how words change once they're projected onto a courtroom screen. Dan recommended notifying every potentially affected homeowner before the HOA could control the narrative. We mailed certified packets containing updated surveys, county records, copies of annexation filings, and a simple letter explaining that each family should independently verify whether the HOA actually possessed legal authority over their property. We weren't recruiting plaintiffs. We were sharing facts. What people chose to do with those facts became their own decision. The reaction was faster than anyone expected. By the end of the first week, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Mrs. Alvarez called first. She'd paid nearly $9,000 over 4 years for landscaping violations after her late husband's health declined. Then came the Harris family, who'd been fined repeatedly because their grandson kept a fishing boat beside the garage during summers. Then retired firefighter Glenn Mercer, who'd spent thousands replacing perfectly good fencing because the HOA demanded a different color. Every conversation ended the same way. "Wait, are you saying they may never have had the right?" I hated answering yes because every yes represented another family that had been manipulated for years. Meanwhile, Preston's confidence disappeared almost overnight. 3 board members resigned within 2 weeks, claiming they had relied on information provided by the president and management company. The HOA's insurance carrier issued a preliminary reservation of rights letter, effectively warning that intentional fraud and unauthorized governmental conduct likely fell outside policy coverage. Translation: they were on their own. One afternoon, Dan invited me to sit quietly in the back of a mediation conference while attorneys discussed possible settlement options. Preston walked into the room looking nothing like the polished executive I'd met Monday morning. His suit was wrinkled, dark circles hung beneath his eyes, and he kept rubbing his temples as though trying to erase an invisible headache. He offered to rebuild my workshop exactly as it had been, replace every documented tool, reimburse demolition costs, pay emotional damages, and cover attorney fees. A week earlier, that proposal would have sounded unbelievable. Dan didn't even look at me before answering. "No." Preston blinked. "No?" Dan folded his hands. "This case stopped being about Mr. Bennett's workshop the moment we discovered your client exercised authority over properties without lawful consent. You're not negotiating one claim anymore." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Preston finally asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly do you people want?" Dan answered with complete calm. "Accountability." As we walked back toward the parking lot, I asked him if we just made a terrible mistake turning down that offer. He smiled without slowing his pace. "Harold, sometimes replacing what was destroyed isn't enough. Sometimes you have to make sure it never happens to anyone else again." I looked across the street at families mowing lawns, kids riding bicycles, neighbors waving at each other without realizing the legal earthquake already rolling beneath their feet. And for the first time, I understood this story had never really been about one old carpenter or one missing workshop. It was about what happens when ordinary people stop assuming authority is legitimate simply because someone prints it on expensive letterhead. Please send P3 and I'll continue with the final part. The courtroom wasn't dramatic the way television likes to make people believe. There were no surprise witnesses bursting through the doors, no lawyers shouting over each other, no last-second confessions. It was quieter than that. Almost disappointingly ordinary, which somehow made the outcome even more devastating for the people sitting on the other side of the room. Facts have a way of draining all the drama out of an argument once they're laid out in order. Over the next several weeks, the court reviewed county records, historical surveys, title documents, board meeting minutes, engineering maps, and testimony from planning officials who confirmed exactly what Dan had discovered on the very first morning. The Homeowners Association had expanded its claimed jurisdiction years earlier without obtaining the legal approvals required under state law. They hadn't simply made a paperwork mistake. They had acted as though authority existed first and documentation could catch up later. Unfortunately for them, property law doesn't reward confidence. It rewards proof. Family after family joined the case. Some wanted reimbursement for years of assessments. Others wanted compensation for unnecessary repairs they had been pressured into making. One retired couple had emptied part of their savings to replace a perfectly good roof because the board threatened escalating fines. Another family had removed a detached garage after repeated violation notices, only to learn months later the HOA had never possessed legal authority over their lot in the first place. Listening to those stories hurt more than I expected because every person blamed themselves for not asking questions sooner. The truth was simpler than that. Most decent people naturally assume that someone holding official meetings, printing official notices, and collecting official dues must actually have official authority. That's exactly why abuse of power spreads so quietly. Preston testified for nearly 3 hours. Watching him answer questions under oath felt completely different from watching him sit behind that polished desk telling me to let go of the past. The confidence was gone. Every answer seemed to begin with, "I believed," or "my understanding was," until the judge finally interrupted and asked one question that changed the entire room. "Mr. Pfaff, Calloway, can you identify the document that legally granted your association authority over Mr. Kives, Bennett's parcel?" There was a long silence. Papers shuffled. His attorney searched through several binders. Preston looked toward the management representative sitting behind him, then back at the judge. Finally, he admitted, "No, Your Honor, that was it." No dramatic speech. No angry outburst. Just one honest answer that quietly collapsed years of manufactured authority. Several days later, the court issued its written decision. Every enforcement action taken against improperly annexed properties was declared legally unenforceable. Homeowners affected by the unlawful expansion were entitled to restitution. Additional damages would be distributed according to individual claims. And because the association's governing authority had been fundamentally compromised, the court ordered its dissolution under state law. Years of collected dues, penalties, legal expenses, and settlement agreements pushed the financial impact to well over $900,000 by the time everything was finished. Preston sold his house before the final distributions were completed. I never spoke to him again. Honestly, I don't hate the man. I think somewhere along the way he convinced himself that efficiency mattered more than people, that appearances mattered more than ownership, and that if enough people accepted his version of reality, then it would somehow become legal. Life has a funny way of correcting ideas like that. As for me, I spent the following spring rebuilding exactly where my old workshop had stood. This time the concrete foundation was a little wider, the roof a little stronger, and the windows faced west so the afternoon light poured across my workbench exactly the way my wife always said it should. My oldest grandson spent nearly every Saturday helping me frame walls, install cabinets, and organize the new tool racks. Friends from around the neighborhood showed up with donated lumber, old hand planes, clamps, and stories I'd never heard before about furniture I'd built for their families decades earlier. One afternoon, a pickup truck pulled into my driveway carrying an older gentleman I'd never met. Without saying much, he unloaded a beautifully restored cast-iron table saw built the same year as the one I'd lost. He simply smiled and said, "Figured a carpenter ought to have one of these," then drove away before I even caught his last name. That saw still sits in the center of my shop today, not because it replaced my father's machine. Nothing ever could. But because it reminds me that while one person can destroy something in a single afternoon, an entire community can quietly help rebuild it piece by piece. The funny part is that after the HOA disappeared, property values in the neighborhood actually went up. Turns out buyers cared a lot more about honest neighbors than perfectly matching mailboxes. People started talking to each other again instead of reporting each other. Kids played basketball in driveways without someone measuring how long the hoop stayed outside. Neighbors solved problems face-to-face instead of through violation letters. Looking back now, I sometimes think losing my workshop was the most expensive blessing I've ever received, because if they hadn't crossed that line, nobody would have discovered the much bigger one they'd crossed years before. So here's what I'd honestly like to know from you. If an organization believes it's protecting a community but starts ignoring the law to do it, does every good intention become meaningless? Or do the results somehow justify the methods? Let me know where you stand in the comments, because I have a feeling this conversation is going to split opinions right down the middle. And if you've ever watched ordinary people stand together against someone who thought power made them untouchable, share your story too. I'd love to read it, because sometimes the best reminders that fairness still exists don't come from courtrooms. They come from people who simply refuse to stop asking one very important question: who actually gave you the right?